Hello again, and welcome to Lecture 8 of the Baroque era. Last time I did a sort of a compare-contrast on the lives and careers of J.S. Bach and George Frederick Handel, and I focused on the oratorio, in particular the best-known oratorio of all time, Messiah by George Frederick Handel. Today I'm going to talk specifically about the Lutheran church cantata, and of course the greatest composer of Lutheran church cantatas is without a doubt J.S. Bach. And I did talk about Bach a little bit, about his life and times in the previous lecture. And one thing that I pointed out was that J.S. Bach was not nearly as famous, as well known in his own time as Handel was. Handel was widely regarded as the greatest living composer of his day. Bach was really little known outside of northern Germany, and even there he was known primarily as an organist, not necessarily as a composer. Partly this may be because much of his music wasn't even published until the 1720s. And as I said, Bach was composing in what was kind of considered to be an old-fashioned style by that time. And after Bach's death in 1750, really very few people were at all familiar with the music of J.S. Bach. Really only other musicians, people like Mozart, who was familiar with Bach's music, and Beethoven, who was very familiar with it and was greatly influenced by it, especially in the later phase of his career, as we will see when we get to the classical era. But aside from musicians and perhaps certain music lovers in northern Germany, Bach was not widely known until really around 1830. This is when we see the beginning of this revival in interest in J.S. Bach. And this was because, as we will find out in the Romantic era, when we get to the music of the 19th century, the composer Felix Mendelssohn happened to be in Leipzig, the town where J.S. Bach had spent the last 27 years of his life as music director for the Lutheran churches in Leipzig. And Mendelssohn discovered in the basement of the St. Thomas's Church, where Bach had worked, a piece of music, a manuscript for the St. Matthew Passion. Now, a passion is basically a big oratorio based on the section of the gospel, any of the four gospels. In this case, it was the St. Matthew Passion, which Mendelssohn discovered. The text of that gospel dealing with the crucifixion of Christ. And so this mammoth work was discovered by Mendelssohn, hadn't been performed since Bach's lifetime, probably nearly 80, 90 years before. Mendelssohn discovered this music, put on a concert of it, and this is what started, which rekindled this interest in the music of J.S. Bach. There were Bach appreciation societies that began to spring up all over Germany and later the rest of Europe. Bach's music began to be collated and published and made available. And today, 200 years later, if you were to take a survey of classical musicians or music lovers, I think you would find that the vast majority of them would agree that Bach is the greatest composer of all time. But again, that was not at all true in Bach's lifetime. And as a result of his being not nearly as famous as Handel, we know less about his life than we know about Handel's. We do know quite a bit, just not as much as we would like to. We know that, as I mentioned before, he came from a family of professional musicians. His father, his grandfather, his uncles, his brothers, his cousins, and then eventually his sons and their sons generally tended to become professional musicians. Bach himself was the youngest of 8 children, was orphaned. Both of his parents died when he was about 10 years old. He was sent to live with his brother, who was a professional musician, his older brother, and sort of apprenticed under his brother. And when he came of age to earn his own living, Bach had a succession of different jobs, a few years here, a few years there, as either a church organist or a court organist, a court musician, working for a prince or a duke, until eventually he accepted this position as music director for the Lutheran churches in the town of Leipzig. Leipzig was a university town. That's probably why Bach took the job there. It is believed that maybe he wanted to get this job so that his children could go to the University of Leipzig. And in fact, Bach was involved with the college students, the musical college students of Leipzig. The book mentions that there was a musical group called the Collegium Musicum, the musical college, which is a group of student musicians, and Bach was their director. And they had a regular gig every weekend at Zimmermann's Coffee House in Leipzig, which is, I guess, no longer there, unfortunately. But if you happen to be strolling through Leipzig and you heard music playing outside of Zimmermann's Coffee House, you might see J.S. Bach there leading his group of student musicians. So in addition to composing all of the music for the four churches, the four Lutheran churches in Leipzig, and teaching music to the students at the school, which was affiliated with the Lutheran churches in Leipzig, Bach also conducted this student group, the Collegium Musicum. Tremendously busy guy, and very, very productive. As I said, Bach composed all different genres of music except opera. Unfortunately, many of his works are lost. That is, we know they existed, but they perhaps weren't published in his lifetime. They were maybe just, written and copied by hand and lost. So, for example, just speaking of the cantatas, the type of piece that we're going to focus on today, Bach is known to have composed about 300 cantatas, but about 100 of them are missing. We don't know what happened to them. They are lost. Every once in a while, some work by Bach or another composer is discovered. And sometimes we're not even really sure if it's by Bach or not, because it may or may not be in his handwriting, which is recognizable. It may have been copied by a student or by some other musician. And so there's this whole verification process, etc. But be that as it may, today we're going to focus mostly on the genre known as the Lutheran Church Cantata. And in order to understand the cantata as a genre of music, it's sort of like an onion. There are multiple layers that we have to peel back. We have to understand the context of the Lutheran Church itself and Luther's beliefs in terms of his ministry and the role that music played in it. We have to understand what a chorale is. We have to understand how it relates to the scriptural text that it will be based on, that any individual chorale will refer to or be based upon. And in the case of this particular cantata that we're going to look at, that is used as an example in your book, cantata number 140, we have to understand a little bit about Jewish wedding rituals of the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago. So let's begin with a definition of what a cantata is. The book already mentioned there are two different types of cantatas. There are secular cantatas, but we're going to focus on the church cantata. A cantata, remember, the title cantata simply means vocal piece, and it's based upon the Italian word for chant. So a piece that is sung or chanted is a cantata, in the same way that a piece that is played or sounded on an instrument is a sonata. But a cantata is usually a work that is relatively brief, not nearly as long as an opera or an oratorio. A cantata might be between 15 minutes and a half hour. It will usually have between 4 and 7 different movements. And it is for singers and instrumentalists, maybe a small orchestra, maybe about 20 a 20-piece orchestra and an organ. Right? And in the case of the Lutheran church cantata, every single cantata will be based upon a particular chorale. So the chorale is like the foundation of the cantata. What is a chorale? A chorale is a hymn. It's basically the repertoire of the Lutheran Church. The hymns of the Lutheran Church are referred to as chorales. They are very simple. They're very easy to sing. They are monophonic. They usually have a very simple melody with one note per syllable of text, what we call syllabic. And of course, they are written in such a way to be easy to sing, because one of Luther's ideas, among the many ideas that Luther had about how his church would be different from the Catholic Church that he had tried to reform and ultimately broke away from, the Reformation, which happened, remember, back in the Renaissance. One of his ideas was that the congregation should be more involved in the service, and one of the ways that they can be involved is through music, by singing in church. And we might think, well, yeah, there's always singing in church, isn't there? Well, in the Catholic Church, the congregation did not sing. The priests and the monks and the choir would sing, but not the congregation. Luther's idea was that the congregation, in addition to having sort of a direct relationship with God, again, an idea that is antithetical to the Catholic tradition, where the purpose of the clergy is to mediate between the lay person, the average person, and God. Right? The clergy are the middlemen, is one of the things that Luther wanted to do away with. Luther believed that individual lay people should read the Bible. The whole idea of Bible study, of reading the Bible on your own, it begins with Luther. The Catholic Church frowned on this. They said, unless you're trained, a member of the clergy, you shouldn't be reading the Bible on your own, because you aren't trained to understand it. You will misunderstand it. And that error can lead to sin, and sin leads to hell, etc. But Luther's idea was no. The average person should have a direct relationship with God, should read the Bible on their own, should participate actively in religious services, and that includes singing. Because music, again, one of Luther's beliefs, that the gospel can be preached through music just as much as through speech or through reading the Bible itself. Okay, so in the early days of the Lutheran Church, Luther and his various assistants, especially a man named Walter, started sort of assembling this repertoire of chorales, these simple hymns. And very often these chorales were actually based on melodies that people already knew, like popular song melodies or folk song melodies of the day. And Luther would just, take the words out and insert some kind of devotional or biblical or religious text of some kind. So what we see actually is something kind of similar to what happened in the early days of the Catholic Church. So remember, Catholic Church music begins with Gregorian chant, which is simple, it's monophonic, it's easy to sing. But as time goes by, composers use the pre-existing Gregorian chants that have been handed down for generations, centuries, as the basis for more elaborate compositions, like organum, or like the Mass, or the motet. These are all based ultimately on Gregorian chant. Something very similar happens in the Lutheran Church. We have chorales, and composers take these simple chorales and use them as the foundation for more elaborate, often polyphonic works that are multi-movement, that involve not just singers, but instrumentalists, organs, choirs, vocal soloists. And all of this is to reinforce the message of the text that is found in that chorale, the text of the hymn. And just as in many church services today, the hymns, or chorales, would be chosen based upon their text, because the text would relate to whichever particular scripture reading was going to be read in that particular Sunday. So the music director of a Lutheran church is working closely with the pastor. And the music director's job is not just to provide uplifting, pretty sounds, for the congregation to hear, but to actually reinforce the message of the gospel, of the scripture readings that would be read that particular Sunday. So presumably the pastor and the music director would get together and say, okay, this Sunday is this particular day in the church calendar. These are the correct readings from the Bible. Therefore, the correct chorale to go along with them would be, this one. And then the composer would say, okay, I'm going to take this chorale, this very brief, very simple hymn, and I'm going to use it as the foundation for a much larger, more complex, more elaborate work. And then that work is going to be rehearsed and performed on Sunday. And in the case of J.S. Bach, when he took this job as music director of the Lutheran Church in Leipzig, and by the way, that the main church, St. Thomas's Church, is still there. You can see a picture of it in your text. And out in the courtyard of that church, there's a statue of J.S. Bach. Anyway, so when Bach took this job, he had to compose a new cantata pretty much every week for several years. And that cantata would be composed, rehearsed, performed that Sunday, and then he'd have to start a new one. And eventually, when he had about 300 of them composed, he started reusing them. Okay, so every cantata is based upon a chorale. And the cantata that we're going to look at, number 140, the chorale that it is based on, and in fact, the title refers to this, Wachet auf. It's usually translated as Sleeper's Wake, or Awake, a voice is calling us. And the text of that chorale, which I am going to play the chorale for you, you can see it there on page 141 and the words in the original German. But what is this sleeper's wake? Who's asleep? Why do we need to wake up? What is this all about? Well, the Bible verse that this relates to is Matthew chapter 25, which is the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, sometimes known as the parable of the 10 virgins. And by virgin, we don't necessarily mean the exact same thing that is meant today. We mean a young woman who is about to be married, right? An eligible woman of marriageable age who is, a bride-to-be, let's say. And in order to understand this parable, which you might be familiar with and which I'm going to read, the reason that Jesus is speaking to his disciples using this parable, remember Jesus often spoke in parables to try and relate what his apostles could not understand to what to things that they could understand of this world. He told stories to try and using comparisons. And in this case, he is comparing the return of the Messiah himself, the second coming, to the rituals of a Jewish wedding around the time of Christ. In those days, apparently, Jewish weddings were done like this. On the night before the wedding, the bride would still be living, with her family, and the groom is living with his family, and he's going to, marry his bride and take her back to his place. But the way this was done was sort of like a stylized, kind of ritualized elopement, essentially. The groom and his family, perhaps, the wedding party, would set out from the groom's house, and there would be sort of like a torchlit procession, and they would walk over to the bride's house, and usually arriving at midnight, in the middle of the night, again, as if it was an elopement. And he would knock on the door, and the bride would hopefully be ready, and she would need a lamp because they're going to be walking in the middle of the night with her family back to the groom's house in order to have the wedding festivities, right? So Jesus is using this thing which would have been familiar to his disciples to explain how he will return and how we, all of us, have to be ready. So here it is, the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25. At that time, the time of the second coming, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were wise and 5 of them were foolish. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I do not know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Okay, so this is the scripture reading which would have been read on the particular Sunday when this cantata would have been performed in church as part of the service. And first sentence, really, when they talk about the chorale and the church cantata, it says, in Leipzig, or anywhere in northern Germany, sort of like Lutheran Germany, the northern part, in Leipzig, in Bach's time, the Lutheran church service on Sunday was the social event of the week. It started at 7 in the morning and could last about 4 hours. The sermon alone could take an hour, right? So the cantata, in this case, it's a 7-movement cantata, about a half hour long. The different movements of the cantata would be kind of like distributed throughout that 4-hour-long church service. And each movement would be based upon this chorale. They would all sound different, but they would all have this common foundation, which is the chorale, which has this text, which relates to that particular scripture reading. All right. The chorale itself, the chorale that is the basis for this cantata, I'm just going to play it for you on the piano, and you'll notice how simple and how short it is. It takes me about a minute and a half to play through the whole thing on piano. And you've got you've got the music here on page 141. Doesn't really matter if you can read music or not. You could probably follow along with this. It labels all the different phrases, and each phrase ends with this little thing that looks like an eye with an eyebrow over it. It's called a fermata. It just marks the end of the phrase. Notice that the first 3 phrases make up the A section, and they are repeated. Those 3 phrases are repeated, but with different words the second time through. Then we get to the B section, which is the last 6 phrases. Right? Notice also, when we get to the end of each section, the A section, and the end of the B section, which is the very last phrase 3 and phrase 9 are identical. You don't even need to read music to be able to tell that. You can see the same notes and the same lines and spaces. They're identical. So that kind of helps tie this chorale together structurally. So we have basically an A section and a B section. The A section consists of 3 phrases which are repeated. So it's like A, B. And the last phrase of both sections is also a repeat. Okay, so here's how this chorale goes. And these chorales, by the way, the congregation would have grown up from the time they were little children. They would have grown up singing them in church, and they would have been even associated with certain days, certain times of the year, right? Because there's a church calendar, and so they would have grown up singing these from the time they were children, and they would have sort of a very special significance and meaning to them, and an association with the Bible verse, all of that, right? So that when these chorales were embedded within a cantata in a way that you or I, who are maybe unfamiliar with this stuff, we'd find it difficult to pick them out. You know, I'm going to play them for you as they appear in each of these different movements. But if you are if you didn't grow up in this culture, if this is your first time learning about a cantata and a chorale, you might need someone to point out, okay, here's the first phrase of the chorale, here's the second phrase, here's the third phrase. But if you grew up with this music, you would instantly recognize it, and it would have sort of an emotional or spiritual resonance with you. That's kind of the idea. In the same way that if you listen to pop music today, there are sometimes like composers borrow beats or bass lines or riffs from earlier songs and incorporate them or sample them and use them in this newer song, right? And people get to, oh yeah, that's the bass line from whatever, or that's the beat from some older song, right? But you would only pick up on that if you were familiar with the older song. Something very similar is going on here, right? As the chorale is used as the foundation for the cantata. Anyway, so follow along as best you can on page 141 as I play on my little keyboard here the different phrases of this chorale. So here is phrase 1. Phrase 2. Phrase 3. And now we repeat with different words. Phrase 1. Phrase 2. Phrase 3. Phrase 4. We're in the B section now. Phrase 5, which has the same notes but different words as phrase 4. Phrase 6. Phrase 7. Phrase 8. And phrase 9. Okay, so that's the chorale. Now, I'm going to play 3 of the different movements. The first movement, the third movement, I believe. Fourth movement and the 7th movement. The first, 4th, and 7th movements of the chorale. Basically the first, the middle, and the last of these 7 movements. All right. Now, remember the context. Remember the scripture reading. What we are trying to dramatize in music here is a wedding. There's a wedding processional. The groom is approaching through the night, and it's a festive occasion. It's a wedding. It should sound kind of upbeat and like we're anticipating something. Not, we're anticipating the groom, but remember, that's just kind of like an analogy. It's a symbol for Christ's return, right? And we, the brides, have to be ready. We have to have our oil in our lamps, right? We have to be ready to come out to meet him. Okay, so what we will hear, by the way, is good old ritornello form. The orchestra will play this ritornello melody. This sounds kind of like a processional, like a wedding processional, the kind of music you might hear at the beginning of a wedding. And then we will hear the different phrases of the chorale melody, and in between each of the phrases, we have the ritornello coming back, right? Remember the idea of ritornello form. We have a melody that we hear at the beginning, we have something contrasting, in this case, a phrase of the chorale, and then some more of the ritornello, and then the next phrase of the chorale, and then some more ritornello. And in the end, we should hear, again, we should close things off with the ritornello melody itself. So let's listen to it, if my computer will cooperate with me. This is the first movement of Cantata number 140, Sleeper's Wake. This is the ritornello. And there's a lot going on, but you're going to hear the chorus singing the first phrase of the chorale beginning right here. Notice how the notes are stretched out and sustained, but it is that chorale melody. Here's phrase 2. Phrase 3 coming up. So we're at the end of the A section. We go back to the beginning. Ritornello melody. Because remember, the A section repeats. And since the A section repeats in the chorale, it also must repeat in this first movement of the cantata. The whole cantata, each movement is based on the structure of the chorale. So we're getting to the end of the ritornello. And here is phrase 1 of the chorale again. Phrase 2 coming up. Phrase 3 coming up, and listen to the tenor singing, Wach, get auf, wake up, wake up. Now we're moving into the B section. And we're going to hear the other 6 phrases of the chorale. After we get through the ritornello. Here we go. Phrase 4. Ritornello. Phrase 5. Now with all those different voices singing different things, and here it's just, they're singing Alleluia, it sounds kind of chaotic. That's exactly the atmosphere at a wedding. The bridegroom is coming. It's a wedding in the middle of the night. Get ready. We've got to go. You know, if you've ever been in a wedding, it can be kind of hectic. Phrase 5 is coming up. Here it is. Sorry, phrase 6. That was phrase 6. It was really buried in there, hard to hear. Phrase 7 is coming up. Ritornello and phrase 7. And phrase 8. Ritornello. One phrase left to go, phrase 9. So we've heard all of our phrases. So we can go back to the ritornello, and that'll take us to the end. And this appearance of the ritornello is exactly the same as the way we heard it at the beginning. Kind of ties the whole movement together. Okay, so that was the first movement, and the chorale was it was really buried in there. It was difficult to hear. If you hadn't had me, even with me, playing it along on the piano, it might have been quite difficult to pick out. You'd have to listen to it multiple times. But what Bach does in each movement of this cantata, remember there's 7 movements, the chorale starts out in the first movement as being sort of hard to pick out and buried in the background. In each successive movement, the chorale moves more and more to the foreground until we get to the very last movement, which is really nothing but chorale. It's just the chorale, instead of being monophonic, it's harmonized in 4-part harmony by J.S. Bach. And but we'll get to that after we listen to the 4th movement. So in the 4th movement, we have the same chorale melody, but we have ritornello form, but we have a different ritornello melody. We have a different mood, right? And this one, again, we have this feeling of it's sometimes referred to as a nocturne. We are walking in the night back now to the house of the groom, right? And the words are, in this listening guys on page 144, Zion, Jerusalem, Zion hears the watchmen singing. What are the watchmen singing? They're saying the bridegroom is coming. Zion hears the watchmen singing. For joy her very heart is springing. She wakes and rises hastily. From heaven comes her friend, resplendent, sturdy in grace, mighty in truth. Her light shines bright, the light from her lamp, because she's got the oil in her lamp, right? Her light shines bright, her star ascends. Now come, you holy crown, you worthy crown, Lord Jesus, God's own Son, Hosanna. We all follow to the joyful hall and share in the Lord's Supper. So again, this analogy of the coming of the Lord and our following him to this joyful celebration. And again, ritornello form. This movement you might be fairly familiar with. This is probably the single most familiar of any movement from any of Bach's cantatas. And this time you will hear the chorale more clearly, the individual phrases. They're going to be sung by the tenors. But first, of course, we will hear the orchestral ritornello, and it sounds like this. And again, you can imagine sort of this dignified processional walking from the house of the bride to the house of the groom. All of this is ritornello. And here comes the first phrase of the chorale, sung by the tenors. Notice it's kind of hushed. Phrase 2. Notice there's a little embellishment there. It's not literally, here's phrase 3. So now we're back to the beginning, ritornello melody. We're repeating the A section. We're going to hear those 3 chorale phrases. And I was pointing out, these melodies are so familiar. Bach, or other composers, plenty of composers wrote cantatas. they might slightly embellish, put little decorations, little ornaments in the melody. So that's what you were hearing there. And we're coming to the end of this appearance of the ritornello, and we're going to hear phrase 1 again, but with different words. Phrase 2. Phrase 3. And we hear the ritornello bringing us to the end of the A section. And that means we're going to move into our B section, and we'll hear the other 6 phrases of the chorale. And notice how skillfully Bach combines the ritornello, which he himself composed, with the chorale. Here's phrase 4, phrase 5, phrase 6, ritornello carries on, and then we'll get to the last 3 phrases. Here it comes. That's phrase 7. Phrase 8 coming up. And phrase 9. And ritornello to bring us to the end. And that's the 4th movement. Finally, the 7th movement, and remember, any one of these movements could be on your listening, in your listening questions. Okay, so the 7th movement, it says 7th movement, chorale. So this time, no ritornello form. All we have is the chorale melody itself, which remember was probably written before Bach was even born. These chorales, Bach took these pre-existing melodies and used them as and not just Bach, countless other composers who were Lutherans, Lutheran church directors, all throughout northern Germany, took these pre-existing chorales and used them as a basis for a cantata. In this particular cantata, Bach chooses to have the last movement be simply the chorale itself as harmonized by J.S. Bach. So the melody Bach took, but then he harmonized it for four-part choir. And I feel like I should mention here, Bach's harmonizations of these simple chorales are basically the Bible for anyone who wants to learn harmony, and have been for at least 100 years, probably more. If you are a music major, and this was my own training, my teacher's training, my students that I teach in music theory classes, the Bach chorale, such as we're going to hear in this case, the chorales, Lutheran chorales harmonized by J.S. Bach, are the means of choice, the method of choice for learning harmony, for learning how chords work and how they follow each other in chord progressions, and how you can modulate from, and principles of voice leading, all this stuff which I don't expect you to understand, but take it from me. What the white rat is to biology, you know, for people learning biology, you study the behavior of rats, you dissect them, you give them whatever kind of drugs to make them act a certain way, and you learn from white laboratory rats about other, other creatures, especially mammals, right? That's like the lab animal. The equivalent for music theory, the lab animal of music theory, is the Bach chorale. And any classical musician, I guarantee you, I think I've got one right over on that piano over there, they will have a book of the Bach harmonized chorales so that they can go through and study them and analyze them, because they're like an object lesson in harmony. All right. So here is one such chorale, and again, you're going to have those same 9 phrases in that same structure. First 3, and then those first 3 repeat, and then the other 6. And the words here are: Gloria be sung to you with men's and angels' tongues, with harps and beautiful cymbals. Of 12 pearls are the gates at your city. We are consorts of the angels high about your throne. No eye has ever sensed, no ear has ever heard such delight. Of this we rejoice, E-O, E-O, forever in sweet joy. All right. Okay, so here it is, the last movement, the chorale movement of the cantata number 140. Let's go back. It started like not right at the beginning. There's no ritornello this time, so it's hard to get it to start right at the beginning. Here we go. Phrase 1. Phrase 2. Phrase 3. We repeat phrase 1. Repeat of the A section. And here the congregation would be singing along. Phrase 3. Phrase 4, B section. No eye has ever sensed, no ear has ever heard. Softer this time. Such a delight. Of this we rejoice. E-O, E-O. Forever in sweet joy. Okay. Now, I realize how complicated all this must seem to anyone who is unfamiliar with Lutheran theology or obscure Jewish wedding rituals from the 1st century A.D. or chorales or cantatas. But if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Just remember, the chorale is a very simple, basic hymn, right? A cantata is a more elaborate, complex composition for choir and orchestra, small orchestra, and organ and vocal soloists, but it is based upon a chorale, and that chorale tune will be the foundation for each of the different movements. Those movements may well be in ritornello form, right? Where we have an opening melody composed by the composer and interspersed between this opening melody which returns. Between those returns, we might have the different phrases of the chorale. The chorale would have been very, very familiar to the congregation at Bach's time, so they would recognize that chorale even if it was sort of hidden and buried within the texture of the cantata. A little harder for us today if we're not familiar with it. Okay, that'll wrap things up for J.S. Bach and the cantata, the Lutheran church cantata, and the chorale, and we'll see you next time.